Chris Butt is third. YH8 Racing is second. Chris Butt is second. Best lap is a 1:32.463. YH8 Racing is third driving a McLaren. Illisp is first. Chris Butt is second. Illisp is P1 driving a McLaren. Chris Butt is second. Illisp is P1. Chris Butt is P2. YH8 Racing is P3. Illisp is P2. The qualification session is at GT Autodromo Lago Maggiore. The race dictator from New Zealand is first. Todd from New Zealand is third. Illisp from New Zealand is fifth. Todd is second. The race dictator is first. Ten minutes remaining in the session. Todd is provisional pole with a 130.074. The race dictator improved is P2 with a 132.122. 2.048 off pole. YH8 Racing from New Zealand is third. The race dictator is second up 0.10. Todd is P1. Best lap is a 130.074. Illisp is P2. Best lap is a 131.696. 1.622 off pole. The race dictator is third. YH8 Racing is fourth. The race dictator is third up 0.38. race dictator improved is second with a 131.513. 1.439 off pole. Todd is first. Five minutes remaining in the session. The race dictator is third up 0.40. Best lap is a 131.513. 1.439 off pole. YH8 Racing is fifth up 0.54. YH8 Racing improved his P5 with a 132.577. 2.503 off pole. That Canadian guy from Canada is P2. Best lap is a 131.290. 1.216 off pole. That Canadian guy improved is second with a 130.764. 0.690 off pole. The race dictator is third. The race dictator improved his third with a 131.356. 1.282 off pole. Todd is first. YH8 Racing is P5 up 0.11. That Canadian guy is second up 0.10 driving a Porsche. That Canadian guy improved his P2 with a 130.476. 2.402 off pole. Chris Butt from New Zealand is 6th up 2.09. Chris Butt improved his P6 with a 132.663. 2.589 off pole. Todd from New Zealand is P1 up 0.22. The qualifying session is now in overtime. YH8 Racing is P5 up 0.10. YH8 Racing improved his P5 with a 132.281. 2.207 off pole. Chris Butt is 6th. Best lap is a 132.663. 2.589 off pole. Broadcast Bot is 20th. The race session is at GT Autodromo Lago Maggiore. Todd is first. That Canadian guy from Canada is second. The race dictator from New Zealand is P3. Illis from New Zealand is fourth. YH8 Racing from New Zealand is fifth. 20 minutes remaining in the session. Race start. YH8 Racing passed Illis for fourth. That Canadian guy is second. The race dictator is third. That Canadian guy is P2. The race dictator is third. That Canadian guy is second. Illis is P4. Chris Butt from New Zealand is P6, 0.5 behind YH8 Racing. The Race Dictator is third, 0.6 behind that Canadian guy. Illis is P4 driving a McLaren, 0.8 behind the Race Dictator. The Race Dictator on lap 2 is third, 0.8 behind that Canadian guy. Chris Butt is P6, 0.6 behind YH8 Racing. The Race Dictator on lap 2 is P3, 0.8 behind that Canadian guy. That Canadian guy is P2, 1.2 ahead of the Race Dictator. The Race Dictator is third driving a McLaren, 0.8 behind that Canadian guy. Illis is P4, 0.8 behind the Race Dictator. The Race Dictator is third, 0.7 behind that Canadian guy. Illis is P4, 0.6 behind the Race Dictator. The Race Dictator is P3, 0.2 ahead of Illis. Illis from New Zealand is fourth, 0.3 behind the Race Dictator. Illis was 0.9 faster last lap. 15 minutes remaining in the session. The Race Dictator is P3, 0.6 ahead of Illis. Illis is P4, 0.9 behind the Race Dictator. The Race Dictator on lap 4 is P3, 0.6 ahead of Illis. Illis is fourth. Best lap is a 1:31.347. 0.896 off the fastest lap. The Race Dictator is third, 1.4 ahead of Illis. Chris Butt is 6th, 1.0 behind YH8 Racing. The race dictator is P3, 1.5 behind that Canadian guy. Illis is 4th, 1.5 behind the race dictator. The race dictator is 3rd, 1.3 behind that Canadian guy. Illis is 4th, 1.7 behind the race dictator. The race dictator is P3. Best lap is a 1:30.718. 0.267 off the fastest lap. The race dictator lost P3 to Illis. YH8 Racing is P5, 2.0 behind the race dictator. The race dictator was 1.3 faster last lap. Illis is P3, 3.3 behind that Canadian guy. YH8 Racing from New Zealand is P5, 1.9 behind the race dictator. Illis is P3, 3.4 behind that Canadian guy. Ten minutes remaining in the session. YH8 Racing is P5, 2.8 behind the race dictator. YH8 Racing was 6.7 faster last lap. Illis is P3 driving a McLaren, 3.6 behind that Canadian guy. YH8 Racing from New Zealand is P5, 3.5 behind the race dictator. Chris Butt entering the pits is P6. The race dictator on lap 8 is 4th, 3.2 ahead of YH8 Racing. Illis from New Zealand is P3, 4.0 ahead of the race dictator. race dictator is fourth, 3.7 behind Illisp. Illisp is third, 2.9 ahead of the race dictator. The race dictator is P4, 3.1 behind Illisp. The race dictator was 1.3 faster last lap. Illisp is third, 2.6 ahead of the race dictator. The race dictator is P4, 2.8 behind Illisp. Illisp is P3, 3.3 ahead of the race dictator. The race dictator is fourth, 3.3 behind Illisp. Illisp is third, 3.3 ahead of the race dictator. The race dictator is fourth, 2.7 behind Illisp. YH8 Racing on lap 10 is fifth. Five minutes remaining in the session. The race dictator is fourth, 2.9 behind Illisp. Crispa exiting pits. That Canadian guy is P2. YH8 Racing from New Zealand is P5, 4.8 behind the race dictator. Illisp is P3. YH8 Racing is P5. Canadian guy is P2. YH8 Racing is P5, 4.9 behind the race dictator. That Canadian guy on lap 12 is P2. YH8 Racing from New Zealand is P5. The race dictator is fourth, 4.3 ahead of YH8 Racing. YH8 Racing is P5, 4.4 behind the race dictator. YH8 Racing was 3.0 faster last lap. The race dictator is P4, 3.6 ahead of YH8 Racing. YH8 Racing is 5th, 4.4 behind the race dictator. That Canadian guy on lap 13 is P2. YH8 Racing is 5th driving a McLaren, 4.0 behind the race dictator. That Canadian guy is P2. YH8 Racing is P5. That Canadian guy on lap 14 is 2nd. The leader has just finished the race. Todd from New Zealand finished first. That Canadian guy finished P2. Illis finished P3. The race dictator finished 4th. YH8 Racing finished P5. Broadcast bot is 7th. Broadcast bot is 7th. The race session is at GT Autodromo Lago Maggiore. YH8 Racing from New Zealand is P1. The race dictator from New Zealand is 2nd. Illis from New Zealand is P3. That Canadian guy from Canada is fourth. Todd from New Zealand is P5. 20 minutes remaining in the session. Race start. Todd passed that Canadian guy for fourth. Todd passed the race dictator for P2. That Canadian guy entering the pits is P5. The race dictator is P3. Todd is P2. YH8 Racing is P3. The race session is at GT Autodromo Lago Maggiore. YH8 Racing from New Zealand is P5. Chris Budd from New Zealand is P6. 20 minutes remaining in the session. Race start. Chris Budd is now fourth. Chris Budd lost P4 to YH8 Racing. The race dictator from New Zealand is P2. YH8 Racing is third. YH8 Racing lost third to that Canadian guy. The race dictator is P2. YH8 Racing is fourth. The race dictator is second. That Canadian guy from Canada is third. The race dictator is second, driving a McLaren, 0.3 ahead of that Canadian guy. That Canadian guy is third, 0.3 behind the race dictator. The race dictator is second, 0.5 ahead of that Canadian guy. That Canadian guy is third, 0.2 ahead of Todd. Todd from New Zealand is fourth, 0.2 behind that Canadian guy. 0.1 ahead of Todd. Todd from New Zealand is third, battling that Canadian gun. That Canadian guy from Canada is fifth, 0.9 behind YH8 Racing. Todd is third, driving a Porsche, 0.3 behind the race dictator. That Canadian guy from Canada is fifth, 0.6 behind YH8 Racing. That Canadian guy was 1.1 faster last lap. Todd from New Zealand is third, 0.2 behind the race dictator. YH8 Racing is P4, 1.0 behind Todd. Todd was 2.2 faster last lap. YH8 Racing passed Todd for third. Todd is P4, 0.3 behind YH8 Racing. 15 minutes remaining in the session. Todd passed YH8 Racing for third. YH8 Racing from New Zealand is fourth, 0.1 behind Todd. The race dictator is P2, 3.0 behind Illis. YH8 Racing is P4, driving a McLaren, 0.7 behind Todd. That Canadian guy is fifth, 2.7 behind YH8 Racing. Todd is P3, driving a Porsche, 2.6 behind the race dictator. That Canadian guy is fifth. Best lap is a 1:30.691. Todd is third, 1.8 behind the race dictator. That Canadian guy is P5, 0.4 behind YH8 Racing. That Canadian guy was 1.8 faster last lap. That Canadian guy passed YH8 Racing for fourth. YH8 Racing is P5, 0.4 behind that Canadian guy. Todd is P3, 0.8 behind the race dictator. Todd was 2.3 faster last lap. race dictator is P3 battling Todd. Todd is P2, 0.8 ahead of the race dictator. The race dictator is third driving a McLaren, 0.8 behind Todd. Todd is second, 0.8 ahead of the race dictator. The race dictator is third, 0.7 behind Todd. Todd is P2, 1.1 ahead of the race dictator. Ten minutes remaining in the session. The race dictator is P3, 1.4 behind Todd. Todd is second, 1.5 ahead of the race dictator. Todd was 1.5 faster last lap. The race dictator is third, 1.8 behind Todd. Todd is P2, 1.7 ahead of the race dictator. YH8 Racing is P4, 2.0 behind the race dictator. YH8 Racing passed the race dictator for P3. The race dictator is fifth battling that Canadian guy. Todd is second driving a Porsche, 1.1 behind Illisp. That Canadian guy is P4, 0.9 behind YH8 Racing. That Canadian guy was 0.9 faster last lap. Todd on lap 9 is P2, 0.6 behind Illisp. The race dictator is P5, 0.8 behind that Canadian guy. Illisp from New Zealand is second, 0.1 behind Todd. Todd was 1.6 faster last lap. That Canadian guy is P4, 0.4 ahead of the race dictator. That Canadian guy was 12.9 faster last lap. Illisp is P2 driving a McLaren, 0.6 behind Todd. YH8 Racing is P4 battling that Canadian guy. YH8 Racing lost P4 to the race dictator. Illisp is second driving a McLaren, 1.4 behind Todd. YH8 Racing is P5 driving a McLaren, 1.5 behind the race dictator. The race dictator is fourth, 1.8 ahead of YH8 Racing. 5 minutes remaining in the session. YH8 Racing is P5, 1.9 behind the race dictator. The race dictator was 2.5 faster last lap. The race dictator is P4, 2.2 ahead of YH8 Racing. YH8 Racing is P5, 3.0 behind the race dictator. The race dictator is P4, 2.6 behind that Canadian guy. Illisp is P2, 3.4 behind Todd. The race dictator is P4, 3.0 behind that Canadian guy. YH8 Racing is P5 driving a McLaren, 0.6 behind the race dictator. The race dictator is fourth driving a McLaren, 2.5 behind that Canadian guy. Illisp is P2, 4.3 behind Todd. Todd was 0.6 faster last lap. The race dictator is fourth, 3.2 behind that Canadian guy. is second, 4.7 behind Todd. The race dictator is P4 driving a McLaren, 4.3 behind that Canadian guy. YH8 Racing from New Zealand is P5. The race dictator is P4, 4.4 behind that Canadian guy. YH8 Racing is P5. Best lap is a 132.174. 2.665 off the fastest lap. The race dictator is fourth. Illisp is second. YH8 Racing is fifth. The race dictator is fourth driving a McLaren, 4.9 ahead of YH8 Racing. The leader has just finished the race. Todd finished P1. Gillis finished second. That Canadian guy finished third. The race dictator finished P4. YH8 Racing finished fifth. Chris Butt is sixth. Chris Butt finished sixth. Broadcast bot is P7.